Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Health Discourse with Sakshi and Sushant. So, hi, Sushant. Good morning.
Very good morning.
Now, folks, today our discussion is going to be something pretty interesting, which has been quite a lot in the industry for some time. It's been like 2 decades since the word genome entered into the Indian healthcare space. And we have seen a lot of companies who claim to have collected a lot of genomics data, which is the DNA, the human DNA. And our discussion is going to be centered, revolving around the same subject today. So, Sushant, my first question to you is that, we have seen that, every academia, most of the industry is focusing on the genomics, right? Now, let us understand what exactly is the gap that genomics fails to address in terms of deciphering human health. Because, as they say that there is this concept called nutrigenomics where DNA tells what you should eat and what you should not. Okay. But what is exactly the missing link when we at Gene Pathletics are talking about mitochondrial and cellular health and bioenergetics? What exactly are they missing in the DNA?
Okay, let me break it down. So let's start with basics. So everyone for layman to understand genomics,
Sure.
gene plus omics, it means study of genes, right?
Right. That's
And
right.
we have been told that, we all know that we have around 25,000 human genes which we inherit from our parents, which
Mm.
is found in nucleus of every cell, right? And it is considered to be a blueprint or what we call is SOP. So people who are in business, who are in management, position, they understand what is standard operating procedures, SOPs. So it is an SOP for your biology, right? It actually codes for specific protein enzymes. So it has directions for cells, right? That what specific protein or enzyme should be activated or not activated in certain scenarios, right? But the important thing is that, it does not have instructions or genes does not know about your anatomical structure. So what I mean by that is genes cannot answer where your hand should be, where your eyes should be, where your head should be, how your body should be structured, right? And this is something very important because in 2003, Human Genome Project was done in USA, and it was at that time assumed that this will solve problem for all cancers in US market. And it's almost 23 years since it has been done, and still in US, if you look at the statistics, around 93% of the you know US population have metabolic dysfunction in spite of doing a human genome project. And similarly in India, if you see, I think as far as I remember, 2010 or something, genome word came into being, and there were a couple of companies started working on the genome, and uh, saw concept of genomics, or your genes are a center of your health, and if you decode genes, if you identify predisposition, genetic predisposition to certain situations, probably we can reduce the risk, and all those narratives came, and you're always still sitting in 2026. And as of now, we all know that 90% of the Indians are carrying a disease, right? Whether it is metabolic, degenerative, oral, or even cancer, and they are not aware of it, right? And probably that is something I'll discuss later part of the part, but we all know that oral health is connected to the overall health, right? So there are two aspects here. Within the cells, we have something called mitochondria, right? Which is an ancient organelle, and it happens around 2 billion years ago. A larger organism actually engulfed this smaller organism, and instead of eating it for the food, it actually maintain a symbiotic relationship, right? So basically, larger organism provided the space and the oxygen, and smaller organism actually did something which was never a capability of a single cell organism, which was, respiration, using oxygen to produce energy, right? Which is a more efficient way of producing energy, right? We all know that we all have learned from a biology class that mitochondria is the energy powerhouse. It produces energy, right? It helps us to fuel a lot of these things, and that's why I want to start it here. Two things: one is the mitochondria, other is the cellular communication. We are going to talk both things, right? So we'll start with mitochondria, and probably I'll speak about mitochondria, then you can ask questions if you have further questions on the mitochondria, right? So essentially, we have 37 trillion cells inside our body, right? And except the red blood cells, we have all the cells have mitochondria, and each cell has around 1,000 2,000 mitochondria on average. And they are around, excluding red blood cells, there are around 7 to 10 trillion of cells. So it means we have around 14 quadrillion to 20 quadrillion of mitochondria, which is much more than the bacteria we have in the gut or in the mouth, right? And these are ancient organelles. So essentially, first thing is wrong, that they do not produce energy, they transform energy. Energy cannot be produced or destroyed, and that's why we have a very limited energy budget for our various aspects, right? And again, so it goes that your sunlight, the sunlight is your is goes on your through products, goes on your plants, and by the process of photosynthesis, plant takes in carbon dioxide, releases oxygen, and produce, and certain fruits and vegetables are made which have carbon based, and those are consumed by us, and then those are electrons coming from the food. They flux inside the mitochondria. There's an electron transport chain in the mitochondria where it is transformed. So when it is by the process of photosynthesis, it is a biochemical energy, and this biochemical energy is transferred into electrochemical energy inside the electron transporter of the mitochondria, where the electrons in the food is actually jump on oxygen and ATP is produced, right? So this energy is being transformed from a biochemical to a bioelectric, right? And this fuels everything, whether you have to produce insulin, different hormones, produce vitamin D, produce bile acid, performing biochemical reactions. And the biggest difference between a dead person and alive, a cadaver and an alive person, is flow of energy. So if a person dies, his genes is same, it doesn't change, right? His molecule is same. Maybe your ATP may convert into ATP and ATP later on, right? Because there is no flow of energy, right? And the organ is same unless the person has died because of some accident and organ has thrashed, right? So essentially, the only difference between dead person and alive is flow of energy, which is controlled by mitochondria. We all know that, right? That is one aspect of it, right? Second, that is one of the many functions of mitochondria. Then other functions, so we have 14 quadrillion mitochondria, and they form a bioelectric network, right? So there are nodes, communication nodes within all mitochondria, and then so they are like a wall, right? So essentially what happens is that, whatever externally it is coming inside the cell, whether it is food or environment or toxins, these mitochondria can scan. They form a roundtable conference. They discuss whether they have to act on that particular external environment, that particular toxin or not, right? And if they decide to act, probably they sense it, they integrate all the information and send signals, which are we call as cytokines, right? So these cytokines are being sent to all cells, mitochondria, and that's how it all drives cellular adaptation, right? So this is one way, and again, this goes to your brain and your so certain cytokines such as GDA15, growth differential factor 15, which is one of the prominent cytokine. A lot of people do not know about it, but it's a stress response, right? So if your mitochondria is experiencing stress, whether it is environmental toxin or whether it is a gut microbiome, oral microbiome mediated toxins, right? Your mitochondria could produce GDA15, mitochondria of every cell except the brain. And again, those GDA15 travels to your brain cells, and the brain cell it is only brain cell that has receptor for GDA15, right? And then they start to reallocate the energy, right? So as I mentioned, we have a very limited energy budget. Energy is allocated to vital functions like breathing, blood flow, right? Growth, maintenance, repair in terms of, differentiation of cells, or maybe, repairing and replacing dysfunction cells, and then stress responses, right? So when there's too much of stressors, GDF15 is released, it actually tells the brain to reallocate energy from growth, maintenance, repair, GMR, to actually to respond to these stressors. And again, this leads to high energy expenditure over time. This leads to hypermetabolism, right? And cells become inefficient to transform energy via respiration mode, and they fall into fermentation mode. That is what we call as cancer, right? In the all these between, in a recent research, it has been found that mitochondria actually controls 66% of the genes, nuclear genes expressed inside the body. So whether a gene has to be turned on or turned off, it is actually done on the instruction of mitochondria. So mitochondria could send a signal to a nucleus, and nucleus can actually, alter the epigenetic, drive the epigenetic modification, and alter specific genes expression that directly impact the activation of specific proteins and biochemical reactions, right? So your genes are being controlled by your mitochondria, which are living in cytoplasm outside the nucleus, right? And they are virtually doing everything inside your body, right? So it's very, in a short way, we can talk a lot on mitochondria, but that's a basic fundamental
So
in some.
apparently, when we are saying that mitochondria, of course, that applies to the physiology of human body as well,
Mhm.
physiological level. That when we are
Mhm.
saying that cellular mitochondria plays a very significant role, so why are they not focusing on the cellular part or the mitochondrial part of it? I
Because
mean, why
they
is it
think,
that?
because they think cells is only about genome. They've not gone beyond that. And I'm going to talk
No, but
about it.
cells definitely it's it comes under the basic education. Even somebody has been from a science background,
Hmm.
it definitely this subject of cells and mitochondria is something
Hmm.
which children know. No more, most of those
Because
who have studied from a
they only know
yeah.
that you consume carbohydrates and fats, it get inside your mitochondria, and it is actually it produces ATP. That is what people think,
Mm,
right? People
mm,
have
mm,
never
mm.
thought, or scientists or all these companies who are focusing on genome, who will say, you have a predisposition to a specific
Also think here that there's a lack of data in terms of the mitochondria. I think that they're choosing to have the be the easy they're choosing the easier path because there's a
that is
lot of
not
data on the genome.
solving. So actually, that is not
I know,
solving a
I
problem,
know.
right?
That's what I feel that they're choosing the easier path
No, see, data
just
is
because they
there.
have data.
So no, the data is there. So if you talk of high blood sugar, you talk of high blood pressure, all these symptoms are downstream of defects in the energetic process of the mitochondria, right? So
Mm,
so
mm,
ideally, why you have high blood sugar level, right? Because your mitochondria is dysfunctional. So insulin secretion needs a lot of mitochondria. Pancreatic beta cells
mm,
needs ATP to secrete insulin. So if the mitochondrial dysfunction cannot produce ATP, it is actually producing reactive oxygen species superoxide. So there is no energy to be secreting insulin. That's why you have hyperglycemia, right? So ideally,
mm,
these are
mm.
a lot downstream of mitochondria. People do not understand that every function, whether you have to secrete insulin, you have to produce cortisol, you have to synthesize vitamin D, vitamin B12. Have to send signal to their brain. All these needs energy, ATP, right? So without that, all these things are downstream of what is happening inside the mitochondria. And even people who say that we have a genetic predisposition to a particular disease, fine, you may have, but that is a secondary risk factor that cannot create a problem, until unless your mitochondria is functional, right? For
Okay.
instance, someone who has cancer, the doctors and the will say we'll target certain driver mutations, right, to
Mm,
kill cancer
mm.
cells. Now, those similar driver mutations would also be there in the healthy cells. It means you have a genetic predisposition to something because of that mutation, but does not mean you would develop that disease. So genes has to actually translate into function, right? And again, I want to get into this discussion. This is very important, and this is what we wrote the blog for, and I'm going to keep it very, very laymanish language, right? So consider that there's a five-star hotel, and
Mm,
there's an recipe, there's a dish to be made for some VIP, and there's a cook, right? And recipe is detailing all the ingredients needed to make a particular dish. right?
Hmm.
But consider this recipe as your genes. Okay.
Hmm.
So now recipe cannot go and take a lighter and switch on the gas and put the ingredients on its own and mix the
There
ingredients and
has to be a force doing that.
right.
There has
There's
to be a
someone
intervention,
doing it.
right?
So that cook is
Yes.
actually reading the recipe, right, and putting the ingredients, making it right at the right heat, at the right temperature, and then it comes to output, which is again a dish, right? So
Hmm.
you know and if the recipe has something wrong, something badly misprinted, something badly written, so the cook will decide, okay, this is something wrong, I will change it, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
This is a perfect analogy of the communication between your cells and genomes.
Hmm.
So we have cells, and you have to understand that there are 37 trillion cells. Each cell has a computational capability of working in a particular defined limited area, right?
Hmm.
So they
Hmm.
have a predicted capacity of maybe what you should do in next 2 days, right? Or
Hmm.
next 5 days, right? And then they have a pattern memories which is coming from their past metabolic efforts and all those, right? So that
Hmm.
is a very simple aspect. Then all these cells are connected together, right? All
Hmm.
cells have a specific cognitive capacity, and when they
Hmm.
combine they form a network which is bioelectric network, right? So they
Hmm.
share the information to that network, and there's a pattern memories. They are reading genetic instructions, and they can
Hmm.
even override the genetic instructions, right? So then the
Hmm.
computational capacity of your body as a whole, right, is
Hmm.
is a sum of all the cognitive computational capacity of all the cells taken together, right?
Hmm.
So sum of the parts is greater than a single, right? So essentially, and then all these cells, the cell collective or this combination, the network knows where your eye should be, where your hand should be, how your mouth should be, where your hair should be, how your structure of body should be. Not even a single cell knows which body organ that cell particular belong to, right? The cell
Hmm.
collective
Hmm.
knows, okay? And that's
Right.
why they work together to drive the anatomical structure, to meet your anatomical goals, how your body shape should be, how to repair cells, how to repair tissues, whether differentiate cells. So all these things work together, right? So they refer to the bioelectric patterns they have stored. They refer to the genetic instructions, and they can even override them, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you may decode your genome, but until unless you're not understanding if these cells are communicating, how they're overriding genetic instructions, and how they're communicating. So probably they with every two cells there's something called gap junction proteins, right? And
Hmm.
that is like a yatch. So there are two ends of a yatch, and that's how they communicate. They send molecules to communicate. Their language is
Hmm.
molecules, right? So they communicate, they tell about a particular situation, and that's how mitochondria also comes into picture. So essentially mitochondria plays a very important role in yielding this gap junction, regulating this gap junction. And then every cell, this is basics of science. Every cell, inside the cell there's a transmembrane potential which is negative, which is minus 70, minus 90 MV, right? It means that there is ion channels, right? So you have to
Hmm.
maintain
Hmm.
that polarized state. So there are ion channels, ion channel regulation. Again, ion channel regulation, make sure this communication happens, right? So they communicate through ion
Hmm.
channels, whether it is potassium, calcium, or
Right.
chloride, right? And so
Basically, see the ion channels. What you're referring to is most of them are the elements of periodic table. I mean, they're
yeah,
actually found
yeah,
in our inside our body,
yeah.
and they are act as the ion channels as well,
Yeah, so
right?
so for
That's
potassium is positive, calcium is positive, chloride is negative, right? So essentially you have to maintain an equilibrium between this flow of these ion channels. So based on the to maintain the polarized state, your mitochondria could impact these ion channel regulation, and cells then communicate that what specific ion channel should move, efflux and influx of ion channels to maintain, and that drives the communication. So when there's an
hmm,
depolarized state, when there's an ion channel disequilibrium, it it
hmm,
it becomes an electrostatic barrier for gap junction. Gap junction closes, and then cells cannot communicate, right? And when cells cannot
hmm,
communicate,
hmm,
your cells detach from the cell collector, they start growing. That is what cancer is,
hmm,
right?
hmm,
Right.
hmm,
So
hmm.
ideally, the
That's
question
right.
is the question also comes, Sakshi, that all these cells have a selfish motive, but their self is very small. So they have a very
Hmm.
small self in a particular area. So how do they
Right.
cooperate? Right? Why
Hmm.
do they cooperate? They are selfish, right? The
Right.
cooperation, when they join together, they learn from their past memories and their metabolic efforts, and then they work together towards maintaining us healthy, right?
Hmm.
So that is the basic thing. A genome, they may even override certain genetic instructions. If there are mutations, they can rebuild it. They can repair the tissues, right? Right.
Hmm. Hmm. So what exactly is the function of the genome in that case? Because when we say that bioelectron is the
Hmm.
precursor for human health,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
That the ion channel crosstalk is there. So so then
Genome
why
has
measure?
its so genome is a hardwired is in hardware. So genome has
Okay.
instructions that what proteins or what enzymes should be coded for, and your cells
Hmm.
read those instructions and code for them, right? So I'm not saying genome is
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
important, but connecting your genetic mutations with disease, or maybe blaming your genes to a particular onset of a disease is absurd, is wrong, because genes cannot do anything on its own. So cells read the genetic instruction and then they code for proteins, and again via bioelectric signals, via signaling molecules, you can reinstate the ion channels, you can reinstate the gap junctions, you can even make the cells override genetic instructions, right? So ideally, you could repair and replace tissues irrespective of genetic defects, right? So
Hmm.
you may
Hmm.
have mutations in healthy cells as well, right? Doesn't mean that you
Right.
are going to develop disease, right?
Yeah, of course, as you mentioned that it's like an instruction manual, right? So the manual cannot work on its own unless there's an intervention from the outside,
Yeah. So
just like the
so
bioelectron,
so
right?
ideally, the idea is that DNA, RNA, protein pipeline. So DNA makes RNA,
Hmm.
and RNA makes protein, and probably the drugs can be focused on to target certain proteins, right? That's an isolated process of
Proteins.
working, right? Because
Or maybe
they
metabolites. I mean, they can
Yeah,
also
whatever.
target the
Yeah, so
metabolites.
so meta
Yes,
protein drives the production of metabolites, right? So metabolites is a
right.
metabolic byproduct of these metabolic reactions, right? So ideally,
Hmm.
they code for they target certain proteins, right? That's how why genome is focused. But again, that does not cure, because even if you're targeting, even in case of cancer, if you talk of cancer specifically, right? So we have identified genes expression products, certain proteins, certain circulatory DNA markers, which is an indicative of a particular cancer situation, and the focusing to kill those using chemotherapy drugs,
Hmm.
right? That is a practice. That is what we do,
Hmm.
right? But what is
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
survival rate of cancer,
Hmm.
right? It is
That's apparently it's very less.
it's
It's
less than
lesser than what they
11%.
expected.
Yeah, it's
It's
less than
lesser than
11%.
what they expected it to be.
Yeah,
So
and
I know.
so again, because thing is, then when you look at these mutations, these genetic byproducts, these gene expression byproducts, there will be there will be different heterogenetic mutation, intertumoral heterogeneity, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
essentially,
Hmm.
you will target some, others will bypass. If you target everyone, you will probably person will die because of toxic drugs rather than that because of cancer, right? And
Hmm.
again,
Hmm.
same genetic mutation as I mentioned about driver mutations could be found in healthy cells. So you're going to impact healthy cells as well, right? So the idea
Right.
is
Right.
that so you have to understand that cancer cells are detached from their family, from the cell collective, and
Hmm.
they're pursuing their pre-symbiotic goals, which was 2 billion years ago when every cell was fermenting. Every cell was
Yes.
fermenting and growing. And as the fuel dissipated, they used to die, right?
Hmm.
And that's
Hmm.
what cancer cells do. They ferment, they produce lactic acid and succinic acid, right? So
Hmm.
lactate is one of the biggest biomarker of fermentation product in fermentation inside the body. Even you look at people who have heart attack, right? So who have heart attack, there's no blood supply, there's no oxygen, right? So to sustain, to make sure that the body does not die for a temporary period of time, there is a lot of lactate being produced. So if you do look at people, if you go for people who go for heart surgeries, right, the doctor will find a lot of lactic inside the bloodstream, right? So essentially those are a way of survival. So that's a survival mechanism, but that's a more inefficient way of actually producing energy, right? So again, everything comes to energy, right? It is your genes. If there's no flow of energy, your genes are not going to do anything, right? And
Mm,
your dietary lifestyle choices is actually pushing a lot of resistance within the electron transport chain, right?
mm,
So understand it is very simple, right? There's a highway, there's a lot of flow of vehicles going on, and when there's too much flow of the traffic jam. So when there's traffic jam, similarly with flow of electrons, again flow of electrons, people may say, let's adopt a calorie deficit diet. It's all about hormones. So if there's an hormone imbalances, and it leads to a lot of ghrelin, or there's low GLP, or a lot of these things. There's an increased supply of, because of inflammation, increased supply of electrons, and there's a traffic jam, so there's flow back of electrons, and electrons fall on the oxygen. It causes production of reactive oxygen species, right? Which is again superoxide that inhibits ATP production. That actually, then there's no ATP, you cannot produce insulin, you cannot produce cortisol, you cannot synthesize vitamin D. So that's a basic problem of everything. Everything is downstream of breakdown in the energetic process of the mitochondria, right?
mm. That's right. So, Sushant, apart from, okay, now that we've understood that why is mitochondria more important than the genes, let us understand what exactly, which pathways actually play a very key role in, understanding that the manifestation of a disease. Let's say we are
Hmm.
measuring cytokine signaling, we are measuring the microbiome respiratory process, we are
Hmm.
also measuring energy efficiency, a lot of other pathways. So, what according to you are the pathways which actually, help us determine the state of a disease in an
So
individual?
there's an integration process. There's no one pathway, right? So essentially, if your gut and oral microbiome are producing metabolites, those metabolites can
Hmm.
actually disrupt the function of the mitochondria. Mitochondria become stressed, they start releasing cytokines. The cytokines release, your brain cells release the cytokines, they start to conserve the energy, they reallocate the energy from growth, maintenance, and repair to response to stress. So you cannot repair and replace dysfunctional cells. You cannot make new cells. You cannot make more mitochondria, right? And then every time there's too much of an increased energy expenditure to respond to these stressors, right? And again,
Hmm. Hmm.
what happens is there's an hypermetabolism, right? So when
Hmm.
there's
Hmm. Hmm.
hypermetabolism, your mitochondria cannot produce energy even in the presence of oxygen, right?
Right.
Because there's too much of high energy expenditure because of a lot of stressors, right? And you understand, even if you look at kidney disease, right? So essentially, for kidney disease also, people go for dialysis. Why? Because there are a lot of toxins and kidney is not able to filter out the toxins, right?
Filter this.
So dialysis, what do people do in dialysis? They clear the toxins, right? That is why, and
Hmm.
have to come every twice a week or sort of thing, right, to clear toxins. The point is the toxins have made the mitochondria of kidney cells dysfunctional. So kidney cells cannot excrete, cannot clear the toxins, right? So there's this,
Hmm.
so at a dialysis stage, you cannot survive from a kidney disease because your kidney have become dysfunctional, right? And then it can be because of your gut microbiome, your oral microbiome producing toxins, uremic toxins, or maybe endotoxins, where that can directly make your mitochondria of kidney cells dysfunction, right? So ideally, and again, mitochondria of the kidney cells is very important for liver and kidney cells, because those are the two organs that do a lot of work, right?
So, Sushant, since we've come to the end of this discussion,
Mhm.
so would you like to conclude this with a note for people listening to this, maybe from the industry or people who are concerned about their health? So, do you have a specific suggestion for them so that they can make their decisions in terms of their research or maybe in terms of going for a test or anything like that?
Okay, so I'm actually pained to see people still promoting genome or nutrigenomics, because nutrigenomics means nutrition based on genes. The genes are static, your genes just don't change, right? And even
Hmm.
if you
Hmm.
are looking at genes expression are downstream of something happening inside the mitochondria, right? So ideally, you are still treating symptoms, right? So
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
just understanding that you have a genetic predisposition to something does not provide any actionable. So you have to understand your cells, you have to understand your bioenergetics, your cellular communication network, your mitochondria, your cytokines, your gut microbiome, oral microbiome, metabolites, your environmental toxin, number of these things, right? Just identify this. This is, this anyone can cook any data in their company and say, we have done this, we have done that, we have improved health, right? But the point is, and second thing is, where is the longitudinal data here, right? So idea is, even I will leave this thought with one simple example: stem cells, right? We all know that stem cells can mobilize and differentiate into different cell types to repair and replace dysfunction cells. So people who are laymanish, so stem cells are sort of cells that can become any cell inside the body to repair them or probably perform
Right.
biochemical functions, right? And
Right.
then tell me one thing, one simple example here question is that how do stem cell know which cell is dysfunctional? How should I go? Your genome is not going to tell, right? You have to read, you have to communicate with cells. Obviously, you read the genetic instructions, right? So just decoding your blueprint does not mean it is going never translate into something, right? You have to actually see based on the genetic instructions what cell is doing, what cytokines they are producing, what mitochondria is doing, what is impacting ion channel disequilibrium, what is impacting gap junction, opening or closing up of gates, right? So essentially, all these things have an important role to play, right? So you can't just look at your genes and say, I've solved everything, or can't just look at gut microbes and say, I've solved everything, right? These are, so essentially, whatever these are doing, you have to see the impact,
Mm.
they impact on your cells, right? Because without
That's
mitochondria, you
correct.
cannot survive. So you have to focus. So focus on mitochondria, focus on understanding how your microbiome and mitochondria communicates. That is the core. Because again, in simple words, mitochondria are cousin of gut microbiome because they are the Asian organelle. They're the same bacteria. Right? They're just a bacteria which have found a space in your cytoplasm inside your cell, and they are doing everything what they need to do to keep you healthy.
Mm.
Right.
Mm.
So give them the right substrate, give them the right signals so that they can
I
keep you
think
healthy.
this study of mitochondria is a very interesting subject at a research
Mhm.
level, and of
Mhm.
course, it will go a long way in helping us, understand which proteins should be targeted in terms of therapeutics and vaccines and all those things, right?
Yeah, not really
So,
protein. I'll say probably you can identify what signaling molecules
what
can modulate
signaling molecules?
can modulate your ion channels and can modulate the cellular communication,
Yes.
right?
And specifically, I'd say non-pharmacological has a lot of has a big way in this,
I'll say
right?
non
The
I'll say
non-pharmacological,
non-pharmacological or non-toxic. So these signaling molecules
non-toxic.
can be made
Yes,
by pharma companies also, right?
yes, yes. So, Sushant, this was a pretty interesting discussion, and let us leave our listeners with this thought that is actually genomics important for them or not, right? And thank you for this discussion. And thank you, folks. We will be soon coming up with another episode. Thank you.
Thank you.